Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Hey Culture. On today's episode, we have the wonderful privilege to have Dr. Joseph W. Bergeron, MD. Dr. Joseph, welcome.
Good to be with you.
We're looking forward to this episode, especially as we're going to speak on the topic of Jesus' crucifixion and the medical evidence for his death. But before we get into that, let me just introduce you to Dr. Bergeron. He is an MD and is a specialist in physical medicine and rehabilitation. He has decades of experience in treating, sorry, I can't pronounce that word,
Musculoskeletal.
injury. It gives him a unique insight about Jesus' crucifixion. I'll have you define that to us a bit later on.
Okay.
He has authored a peer-reviewed article on Jesus' cause of death in the Journal of Forensic and Legal Medicine and a peer-reviewed article in the Irish Theological Quarterly in collaboration with Dr. Gary Habermas on the hallucination hypothesis that seek to explain away Jesus' resurrection. His book, The Crucifixion of Jesus, A Medical Doctor Examines the Death and Resurrection of Christ, is based on his academic research. Dr. Bergeron lectures in conferences, churches, and universities on medical perspectives of the crucifixion and the resurrection of Christ. So I'm specifically looking forward to today. Usually, I've had a mixture of people on the show, but they are usually, the majority of them come from a theological or philosophical background. So I'm looking forward to the unique background that you're actually coming from a medicine background. Maybe you can start by telling us your expertise in what you're treating and define that term to us that I struggled pronouncing.
Well, people in my specialty in the United States do a lot of different types of work. Some do hospital-based rehabilitation, people that come through trauma of various types, neurologic injuries. I've done an office-based practice, which is largely similar to like an orthopedic practice, but I don't do surgery. And I've done a lot of legal work in terms of, personal injury claims and injured workers and that sort of thing. And so that's kind of to be honest with you, I didn't realize it until after I completed it, but I wrote the book in a similar paradigm of how I would frame something that I would submit to a courtroom for a deposition. So that's kind of how I came at it, kind of looking at injuries from the standpoint of causation and outcomes and what we could determine about Jesus' crucifixion and cause of death. When I started studying, how I got into this was I was in 2008, a Christian student group at the medical college asked me to come give a talk, and I don't really know what to talk about. I don't talk about theological and philosophical things. Although, I have an interest in theology, I would say I'm an amateur theologian, amateur in the archaic meaning of somebody who loves theology, but I'm not an academic theologian. So I didn't really know what to talk about. And I thought, well, I'll just read what physicians have written about the crucifixion, because there is a body of literature by physicians attempting to explain and understand what happened to Jesus. And I was kind of surprised to find that there wasn't a consensus among them. There wasn't an agreement about what Jesus' cause of death was. And doing legal work for so very long, I don't have the luxury to go into a courtroom and say, I don't know. I have to give the best and most logical explanation. Understand that my writing and study is based on a forensic reconstruction of the biblical narrative in comparison to what we know occurs medically. I've been very clear, and sometimes people call me on this. I've been very clear in stating we don't have medical records of Jesus' death. We don't have hospital records like somebody that died in a hospital. So we have to do our best, and I think we can do a logical job with a forensic reconstruction of the events. And sometimes people challenge me, which is fine. Reasonable people can disagree, and I think if we do that, um, in an agreeable way, it edges us closer to the truth. But the arguments rise and fall on their logical merit, and that's really what we're pursuing here, and what I've tried to present in the journal articles and in the book, which is based on the journal articles. So that's how I got to doing it. It's kind of a circuitous pathway, an unexpected one. When I gave the presentation at the medical college, the pathologist approached me and said, well, you should write this up and submit it for publication. I didn't want to hear that, because I don't, that's a really hard thing to do for me anyway. An arduous task. Took me 2 years to work on that, not because I have other things to do, but it took me a couple years to kind of get that ready for submission. And so that started kind of there, and that's been, a long time ago now.
That is really interesting, and I have two questions with regards to the works you've written. First is the time that you spent working with Dr. Habermas.
Yes.
Can you maybe tell us a bit more about that? I think a lot of people interested in apologetics have heard of Dr. Gary Habermas.
Yes.
And for those of you who don't know, he is an expert in the field of the resurrection of Christ. He just wrote his magnum opus on the resurrection, a multiple volume book where one volume is about this thick.
Yes.
And it's amazing. Yeah, you could tell us about it and about your time with him.
Well, I had written the draft for the analysis of hallucination hypotheses. This is a very interesting point, because you have critical scholars coming up and saying, well, the disciples were having some kind of hallucination. Because when you look at arguments against the resurrection of Christ, they start to kind of fail in terms of logic. They went to the wrong tomb. Well, that doesn't make you think somebody resurrected. By the way, there was a company of soldiers there. It'd be hard to miss that tomb, or that Jesus really didn't die. He was somehow nursed back to health and moved to the south of France with Mary Magdalene, and then various sorts of fictional stories that present. But the problem is, Roman crucifixion was a fatal event. You didn't survive that. And if in Roman military discipline, if you allowed a capital criminal to escape death, you would be killed yourself. And so going to the wrong tomb, finding an empty tomb, and mistakenly think that Jesus resurrected from the dead, and the kinds of things that people have proposed are just really flawed sorts of explanations. So critical scholars have gravitated towards, they were hallucinating, and I guess I was surprised to find, because critical scholars, when they do that, they have ventured into a medical explanation. It's no longer a theological one, it's a medical one. And I didn't find, and searched for, and didn't find any kind of critique of that idea in the medical community. So these kind of arguments are presented in debates and books and things, not really peer review. And they're not subjected to kind of review by a specialized readership in the medical community. And so I thought, well, I wrote an article about how Jesus died. I have to write, I can't leave him there. I've got to write something about the resurrection. And so I compiled an article. Also took me a couple of years to do that. And then I couldn't get traction among theological journals, because that's not my venue. So I thought, and one of them, the Irish Theological Quarterly, expressed interest, but they said, you're not interacting with theological literature. And so there I am dead in the water. I can't really, I can try to do that, but I'm not going to be able to do it well. And the learning curve would be steep for me. So I thought, well, I went to the national conference on Christian apologetics expressly to meet Habermas. And my question to him was this: do you have a graduate student that would help me buff and puff this to submit it for publication? And he read it and he said he wanted to co-author it with me. I didn't expect that. I'd read his books. I'm kind of an outsider to the apologetic community. When I went to the national conference, I didn't know that it seemed like a movement because there was 2,400 young people there. I didn't know about that. I just kind of gravitated towards Habermas writing because he's a smart guy and delivers cogent arguments in ways that are understandable, and he's going to speak there. So I'm going to go talk to him and ask him if he knew somebody that would help me. And that's how I met him. And then we worked on it. I'm not sure how long, maybe over the course of about a year, I think, back and forth. And you can kind of tell which parts are mine and which parts are his, if you're careful. But so that's how I met him, and and then he was gracious to write the foreword to my book.
And that brings me to my follow-up question: is how did the book came about?
That's also interesting. A friend of mine who's a retired hospital administrator in South India, I gave him my articles, and he said to me, these things get buried in journal articles and nobody ever sees them. And then I thought, well, and it struck me that's really true. I didn't know, I thought I'll write this and I'll submit it into medical literature, and then somebody like me, a student, a doctor, somebody that's maybe interested in this topic, will happen across it. That's what I thought. But then when he said that, I thought, oh, that's right. And I need to try to do something to present it to a broader readership. So that's kind of started me on the course of writing the book, which after the 2 prior articles took me about 3 years working on the book before I got that ready to go. It's kind of an interesting thing. You work on something for several years and you never really know if it's going to get published or not, or if anybody's going to like it or anything like that. And I don't. Again, I'm outside. I'm not a theological academic theologian. I don't really know, and I don't have a good internal barometer to know whether it was even well written or not. It's strange. I did a interview with Eric Metaxas, and we were talking, and during the radio break, he looked at the book and he said, why didn't a big publisher pick this up? And I thought, well, because I don't have an agent, and nobody knows who I am. I don't have a platform. I can't make, it's a niche readership. It's not going to be a bestseller. In essence, it's not going to make people money. And, but that was the first nuance that I thought, well, maybe it's well written. I don't know. I just don't know. So it is it's for niche readership, but my target audience is for college age young people and college graduates, because you probably know, I'm sure you do, and many of your listeners know that young people that have been raised in church, good parents, take them to church, but when they go to the university, 60 to 80% of them abandon their faith, usually in their first year. And so, and I've been through a lot of levels of education, and I even in my time years ago, it's hard for a freshman to counter an angry atheist professor, and there are plenty of those. But also, it shouldn't be that what happened to Jesus is so easily explained away. And I think if people did their homework and took an honest look at it, that they would understand that the information presented in the biblical narrative is not only historically accurate, but we can look at it and say that it's medically accurate, which then points to intrinsic evidence within the text that that they're authentic. Had someone fabricated the Gospels in ways that were mythological or otherwise fabricated, that would be detectable. That's one of the things that inspired C.S. Lewis in his journey of faith, that he understood that the Gospels didn't look like mythological literature.
Well, you're making my job really easily. That beautifully segues into my follow-up question is, I want to get a bit into the specific topic for today, and I think it gave us, when you spoke about the article of Habermas, I think it gave me in the audience a really good preview for our upcoming discussion on the hallucination hypothesis. But before we can get there, we have to go through the topic, but did Jesus really die? And I think we can go, I want to go down two directions. What are some of the arguments, first of all, people make to say that he did not die? And then after that, would like to go, you said there isn't a consensus in the medical community as to what was the cause of death. Mm-hmm. But before we get there, what are some of the objections or arguments made against him actually dying on the cross?
Well, I touched on those, and you know them, and your listeners know them. Jesus didn't really die. The so-called swoon theory, of which there are several iterations, but basically that he didn't die. Was somehow nursed back to health, and he moved to India and formed an ashram, or he moved to the south of France with Mary Magdalene, or there's so many fictional stories that are kind of a little bit comical, I think. So did he not die? Did he actually live through that process? We can talk about, and I'll just go ahead and talk about it. You can stop me.
You can go ahead.
So Jesus, Jesus leaves the Last Supper, Passover, Seder, and he's in the garden, and he is he's praying. He says to his disciples, I feel like I'm going to die. I feel like I'm dying. That's what he says to them. Can you pray with me? Of course, they take a nap. And this is where Luke is the only physician, or Luke was a physician in the Bible. Salute to Luke. He's the largest contributor to the New Testament, largest single contributor to the New Testament in terms of volume of text, 27%. And he recorded that Jesus sweat drops of blood. And I never understood that. I thought that's crazy. I don't know how to reconcile that until I started studying it, realized that it really does happen. It's really rare. It's so rare that we don't really know why it happens, because there's so few cases, and there's only been a couple of them that have been studied in detail, and those I talk about those in the book. But Jesus experienced what's called single episode psychogenic hematidrosis, and that's the rarest form of hematidrosis. It's the medical word for sweating blood. The rarest form, there are only a handful of cases, and they occur before execution. So Jesus, he understood what was about to happen physically, because he would have seen people executed by crucifixion. But he also, of course, bore the weight of the sins of humanity in a way that I don't think we can't understand it. I don't think we can talk about it. It becomes abstract for us to think about that God himself came to the earth as a human being and became sin and died that way. And the Trinity of God was fractured, if you believe in the Trinity, but the Trinity of God was fractured at the crucifixion. It's a complex theological issue. But Jesus is arrested. He goes to a trumped up trial, at the home of the high priest. It was a multi-generational mansion. They beat him there. They had lost capital authority by that time. Nobody knows exactly when, but probably when they became a client kingdom in the Roman Empire, they would have had to become subject to Roman law. They lost capital authority. They didn't lose corporal authority. They could beat somebody up, but they couldn't kill them. So they condemned him of blasphemy and beat him. They threw a blanket over him and hit him and said, "Tell us who's hitting you, Messiah." Then they not wanting to anger the crowd, they conscripted the Roman army to execute him. Now, when he gets to Pilate, Pilate sends him to Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas puts a robe on him, sends him back, and then a whole company of soldiers, one translation says, beat him. We haven't even got to the primary crucifixion part yet. And this is when they put a crown of thorns on him. They put a stick in his hand as a mock scepter. Now, you understand that the Romans were anti-Semitic. They hated the Jewish people, and they would have viewed Jesus as a political insurgent, defying Caesar's authority, and they would have bludgeoned him. And they didn't have any limitation on how much they could beat him. The Jews could do 39 stripes, but the Romans, just whatever just don't kill him, make him walk to the cross, but you kind of take your liberty. And they did. Then he was, after that, he's scourged. So you have multiple beatings. Now, these are medically significant when we're talking about sequential beatings. By the time he gets delivered to the crucifixion team, they are, more than one person is lashing his body. Eusebius said that the lashes would cut through the flesh and you could see their veins and arteries, their inner organs you could see. So the brutality of the lashing would be all over the body, front and back. Now, by the time Jesus was to carry the horizontal section of the cross, the way the crosses were constructed, tau cross would be the vertical section would be permanently fixed in the ground. The horizontal section would be carried by the condemned person naked through the street with a plaque stating the crimes for which they were being executed. They would be nailed to the horizontal section. The soldiers would then place it upon the vertical section, but with a mortise and tenon coupling, and then the feet would be nailed. So you can get the mental image that the soldiers and the condemned were eye to eye, And so by the time Jesus is to carry that, the horizontal section of the cross, I don't know, maybe 30 kilograms, he can't do it. So the Romans aren't going to do it. They conscript Simon the Cyrene to carry it for him. So that kind of gives us an implication that Jesus is starting to go into shock. And initial symptoms of shock would be things like being lightheaded, dizzy, clammy, sweaty, heart palpitations, that sort of thing. So he seemingly was going into those kinds of symptoms before he even got to the execution site. Then, Jesus died rapidly. Crucifixion could last for days. It was expected to last for days. I came across a literary reference that it could last up to a week. Jesus died in 6 hours. So something was happening in his body that wasn't happening to the other people that were executed with him, because he was dead before they were. And the execution team, you don't have to be a doctor to pronounce someone dead, or maybe to pronounce someone dead, but you can recognize if someone has died or not. And the execution team, it was, critical for them to make sure that everyone died that day. It was a day before the Sabbath during a Passover week, so they didn't want to leave the bodies up. The Jews didn't. So they wanted those people to die that day. Well, Jesus has already died. Can we trust the centurion's... sorry.
That's okay.
Can we trust the centurion's medical expertise to know that he had died? Centurion wasn't a physician, but if he let someone escape crucifixion, he was going to die himself. So it was critical that he...
And sorry, if I could interrupt, he might not have been a physician, but he was a trained killer.
He was a trained killer, yes.
They would know how to kill.
Precisely. And that's the point of the spear into the side, because they knew how to deliver a death blow. They were trained in that for sure. Mm. And the spear into the side was not to kill him. It was because they were going to release the body, and they would not allow the slightest chance that he could be alive. And so to say Jesus survived that circumstance is clearly, it's certainly unsupported by the biblical narrative. And really, we don't have a good reason to doubt the biblical narrative, because it's consistent with known crucifixion practices. And in terms of, you might ask, people have asked me, has anyone ever survived crucifixion? And the answer to that is that there is a historical reference to one person surviving. And that was a friend of Josephus, Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, defected and became a Roman citizen. And he wrote his Jewish histories for a Gentile audience. But he saw 3 of his friends being executed during the siege of Jerusalem, and he was able to get a stay of execution. They were all taken down. 2 of them died anyway. One of them was nursed back to health. That's the only literary reference of anyone ever surviving crucifixion. You were not going to survive. You were going to die. Again, because the crucifixion team soldiers would die if you didn't.
Well, that is compelling, definitely.
Yes.
But what is then the trouble within the medical community about not having a consensus about what was the actual cause of death?
Well, it's again, probably because crucifixion is unlike other forms of death where we don't have there's no specific injury to a vital organ. Conceivably, the events occurring in someone's body may have been different from person to person. You may know that, and you've probably heard that a lot of people believe that Jesus suffocated on the cross. Probably listeners don't know that that's a new idea. New meaning in the past 100 years.
Okay.
And it came about by a French surgeon named Lebec and a Czechoslovakian surgeon named Hynek, who were aware of suspension torture. And so they had proposed that idea because people that were tortured by suspension, meaning with their arms directly overhead and feet unsupported, they would develop difficulty breathing. And then Dr. Pierre Barbet, in his book, A Doctor at Calvary, published an eyewitness account, because the Nazis used this in their penal code, and he published an eyewitness account of someone that died of suspension torture. They died in about 3 hours, apparently by asphyxiation, suffocation. Suffocation is the interruption of the respiratory apparatus. Asphyxiation is oxygen deprivation. So you can see the difference.
Yes.
Suffocation leads to asphyxiation, or can. So his book, A Doctor at Calvary, is excellent in many respects and a classic and something you should have in your library. But in Appendix 1 of that book, he puts that description, and the suffocation idea largely became part of church popular folklore since that time, roughly 1950. But prior to that, if you look at ancient literary references to descriptions of people that were dying of crucifixion, um, the idea that anyone had trouble breathing or that they were suffocating during crucifixion is conspicuously absent from ancient literary references. Instead, what they thought was that, and Eusebius and others, described how they thought people were dying, and they thought it was from deprivation, starvation, deprivation. So,
but that would take a couple of days or weeks, wouldn't it?
not weeks.
Not weeks.
Not if somebody's been beaten almost to death anyway. But you still hear the suffocation idea, and it floats around articles by physicians, and people equivocate, and maybe it was this, and we don't really know, and that kind of stuff, and these kind of descriptions. Well, I'm uncomfortable with that kind of verbiage. Again, for legal background, I have to make my best estimation of the most logical thing, and just saying, well, maybe it was, and maybe we don't know for sure. And it is true that we don't know for sure, but we have to kind of point to what is the most logical explanation. I had an emergency department physician contact me a few weeks ago, and he said, he just really didn't believe shock was the mechanism of death. Jesus' cause of death was crucifixion, but in medicine, when we're talking about the cause of death, we're talking about the mechanism of death. And I believe the most logical, and I'm not alone, mechanism of Jesus' death was traumatic hemorrhagic shock, meaning the effects of decreased circulating blood volume due to the effects of trauma. And in my medical journal article, I proposed that Jesus experienced a complication of shock called trauma-induced coagulopathy, where the blood loses its ability to clot. And that occurs in the context of tissue injury, which was diffuse all over his body, acidemia, and hypothermia, decreased core body temperature. And we know that it was cold that day. What? How do you know that, doctor? Because Galileo hadn't invented the thermometer until 1593. How do we know how cold it was? We know it was cold because when Jesus was arrested and taken to the house of the high priest, Peter went and stood by the guards that arrested Jesus.
To warm himself at the fire.
Why did he warm himself? The Bible says it was cold. It doesn't give us a temperature. But you can understand that he lost his bashfulness and stood by the people that arrested Jesus, and he's confronted there. And, so it's probably pretty cold. And it can get to 0 degrees Celsius as in temperature extremes. If you look at weather data for Jerusalem in the first week of April. So the factors, the things contributing to coagulopathy were present. So that's maybe a little bit academic, but I think the most logical explanation to me is that it was a traumatic hemorrhagic shock. And I said, well, emergency room physician contacted me and said, no, I've seen people die of shock. I don't think that's what happened. I think his heart ruptured, and people used to believe that. Actually, that was the first thing I ever heard when I was a teenager. Jesus' heart ruptured, But now people have said, well, there's you may have heard of it. It's called the broken heart syndrome. I don't know if you've heard of that or not, but I'm surprised that people know about that, but they ask me about this. Well, don't you think it was the broken heart syndrome? Well, what happens with it's called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, because in that condition, when the heart contracts, the apical parts of the heart dilate, and it looks like the kinds of jars that the Japanese use to catch octopus. So that's how it got the name Takotsubo. In common vernacular, the broken heart hypothesis, the broken heart syndrome. But in that kind of circumstance, it's kind of rare. It occurs mostly in females greater than age 50. Cardiac rupture usually people do well in that circumstance. They get over it in the absence of underlying cardiac pathology. And just searching for cases of cardiac rupture from that kind of cardiac problem, there are a few, but it's less than 2% in the cases that I read were females over 70. So, and I need to study that further, but it's just, you understand, and that people will say, oh, well, but Jesus was so much different, because the emotional duress he was under is way far and above. And yeah, I get it. I mean, he felt like he was dying. He's sweating blood, and it was a horrible thing for him to experience emotionally as well as physically. But if you want to propose that kind of an explanation, now you've exited medical literature. And you have to do arm waving to say his case was so much different that, we can accept this. Can't we accept something that's more mainstream, that doesn't require special assumptions? And I think then you can look at, I think traumatic hemorrhagic shock is the best explanation. I say the best. I wasn't there, and I don't have the hospital records, and I think we have to do our best job, but I think we can make reasonable conclusions with a forensic reconstruction.
Could you maybe walk us through that type of cause of death, meaning that, like, he's getting the beatings from the Roman soldiers, and you said, but we can see he started going into shock while he was carrying his cross. Maybe go walk us through what is happening in the body, maybe that leads to death for Jesus in that case.
Well, my belief is that Jesus' blood lost its ability to clot, and the progressive effects of blood loss, they'll have biochemical effects, on the body that create acidemia and toxic chemicals and so forth. And I think that's with Josephus's friends, the two of them that died. I think the human body can accept a level of insult by which there's no recovery. And even though they haven't died yet, they're on an irreversible pathway. And I think that that's probably what they experienced. But so you have the biochemical derangement, then you have just the blood loss, you have vasoconstriction that makes all that worse. You have the progressive blood loss where, the heart is beating faster and, can't keep up to the metabolic demands. And at a certain point, then, death is imminent. If you lose 10% of your blood volume, you will start to go into shock. If you lose 40% of your blood volume, your blood pressure goes to zero. You only have about 5 liters of blood in your body. So if you lose 2 of those, that's kind of the end.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. That is compelling.
That's why I think they fractured the legs of the guys next to him. People said, oh, they broke the legs because they wanted them to suffocate. You probably heard that. Right?
I've heard that, definitely.
Yeah. So, but that's an a priori conclusion. Why did you think that he was suffocating to begin with? And why did you think that people suffocated by crucifixion when there really isn't a literary reference to that? Suffocation torture is very different. The vector forces to the chest wall are very different. And there just isn't literary reference. But if you fracture people's legs, now if you remember the Mel Gibson movie, there's a scene where the Roman soldier takes what looks like a sledgehammer and he starts running, and then he breaks the legs of the other 2 fellows. And what they would be trying to do is cause a compound fracture where the bones protrude through the skin. And if you did that to someone, they could drop 500 to 1,000 cc's of blood in rapid fashion. And so you can see how if somebody's on the verge of dying anyway, and you do that, it pushes them over the edge. The other thing is, if you look at the scriptures, and I didn't realize this for a long time, if you look at the scriptures, when the Sabbath is, I think it's John chapter 19, the Sabbath is approaching, and they go to, Pharisees go to Pilate and say, have them break the legs and take the bodies down. What does that mean to you? I think.
What does that mean to me?
I think it means that they perceived it as a death blow.
Yes, I can see that.
Why didn't they say, hey, first thing in the morning, could you break the legs so they die a little bit faster, suffocate a little bit quicker? They didn't say that. At the end of the day, they said, can you break the legs and take them down? So
finish this, we have to go home.
Finish it off quickly, please. And so that's, I mean, I think if you look at it all together, I don't think breaking the legs, you understand Dr. Barbet introduced that idea based on his a priori conclusion that Jesus had suffocated. And so I just don't think the logical merit is there to support that idea. The unfortunate thing is that it still percolates through church folklore, and I'm doing my best to stamp it out, but I can't.
Hopefully this video would help with that. But
and I want you to get pastors to watch this, because when I invite pastors to come to my talk, they don't come.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm just shocked. I think a pastor should be intensely interested. But
I'll send this to pastors.
When I invite pastors to come on, listen, they don't come. It's a peculiar thing to me. I don't understand it.
No, I'll send it to a few of them and ask them to spread it. But so my question is, so theologically we understand why it was necessary for Jesus' bones not to be broken because of the prophecy being fulfilled.
Yes.
But from a medical standpoint, why do you think that they rather first check with the spear than to also crush Jesus' femurs?
Say that again.
Why, from a medical standpoint, do you think they chosen not to break Jesus' bones, but first pierce him?
Because they understood he was already dead.
Okay.
And the chest wound was not a coup de grace. It was not to shorten his suffering and be nice for a minute. It was because they were going to release the body. And as I said previously, they knew how to deliver a death blow. So they knew where to put the sword if you're going to impale the heart. And that's precisely, what they did. And I think that's why we have that, John has that unusual description of water and blood from the side.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, medically, what does that mean? Water and blood coming out?
Well, again, people sometimes disagree with me. And it's their privilege to be wrong if they'd like to be. But
I like that.
But blunt trauma to the chest wall can cause trauma to the lungs. It can cause the lungs to collapse, and it can cause fluid to collect around the lungs. That's called pleural effusion. A pleural effusion is generally clear. And so a spear entering Jesus' chest would have first encountered a pleural effusion, which would have been clear and looked like water to an observer. When it ruptured the heart, the blood that would be remaining in the heart would mix with the pleural effusion, and it would have the appearance of blood. And so I think that we can, Origen, the church father, I believe that was a miraculous sign, but I think we can explain that medically without difficulty. Some people have said, well, maybe he ruptured the heart, and the blood has solid and liquid components, and they will separate and so forth. And so maybe that what we saw was serum, and then later the red components of the blood. The problem is the ejection fraction of the right ventricle is about 90 cc's. It's not much. So I don't think if in the absence of fluid, if you impaled the chest and just and punctured the heart, I don't know if there would be adequate fluid to traverse the chest cavity and exit the chest wall in a way that would be visible. I think you really have to say there was probably fluid around the lungs, what's called a pleural effusion, that then mixed with a small amount of blood in the right ventricle is a lower pressure system, more likely to have a small reservoir of blood at the moment of death. And traditionally, it's thought that the spear entered the right side of the chest wall. At least that's what's on the Shroud of Turin, and that a small amount of blood mixing with the pleural effusion would exit the chest wall through the spear wound and have that appearance described by John.
Okay. And if you would see that, would that also not just, like you said, is to make sure that really make sure, even though they know he was already dead. But yeah. I've heard it preached that it was also a sign that he is already dead. The fact that water and that it was what's the word? Yeah, like a tell that he was in fact dead. Almost as it was a way of checking whether he's dead.
Well, I don't think you need to do that to check whether he's dead or not. I think they did that. I mean, I guess I don't understand that premise. I think they knew he was dead. I don't think, that's why they didn't break his legs. And the scriptures say that's why he didn't break his legs. They delivered what would have been a death blow. If you fought a gladiator, he was going to try to spear you in the chest, right?
Yeah.
So they did that to him because they were releasing the body, and they didn't want any shadow of a doubt that he was still alive. Again, because it would mean their death. And, most of the time when people were crucified, their bodies were left on the crosses to be eaten by scavenging animals. This was an unusual case where the Pharisees asked them to take them down because it was the Sabbath of a Holy Week, Passover. So otherwise, their usual protocol would have been to leave the bodies there. It was permissible to request the remains for burial, which Joseph of Arimathea did, but otherwise it would have been left. So, and you can understand that the use of crucifixion was as a deterrent for political insurgents and slaves, and how horrible that would be to see a body decay and be eaten by scavenging animals. And they would have seen that because it was common practice.
Do you think, and this could be speculation, but do you think the fact that Jesus would have been seen as a political what do you call it, revolutionary against the Romans, do you think that the torture he suffered before the crucifixion was worse than the two thieves, and that's part of the reason why his shock was worse and he died earlier than them?
Precisely. That's what I was saying, because he endured a series of beatings, first at the home of the high priest, secondly by the Roman soldiers, third scourging before he ever gets to the execution site. And I think that sets up a cascade of events biochemically in his body that lead to the derangement of the blood clotting mechanism. And the blood, or the trauma-induced coagulopathy, the blood losing its ability to clot, I think at least has some explanatory merit, because it can explain why Jesus died so quickly. It could offer some explanation about why blood flowed from the chest wall. Not the only reason, but it's one reason. And then, when Jesus was at the Last Supper, I think it's Matthew 26, he inaugurated the new covenant. That was a covenant ceremony. It wasn't just the whole Passover celebration. He was inaugurating a new covenant. There's only one prophecy in Jeremiah that describes a new covenant, right? And it's a transformation of the human heart, and God's redefining his relationship with humans. And he said, "This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out." He said his blood's poured out. So I think he said that his cause of death would be exsanguination, blood loss. So that's the theological point, but I think that fits with that.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Is there anything else? I see we're getting close to the hour mark. Is there anything else you think is significant that you would still like to add with regards to Jesus' death?
No, I think the main point of the study is that that because we can explain it in modern medical understanding, that it points to the authenticity of the biblical narrative, intrinsic authenticity, in a way that would be absent from mythological literature, or a way that could be contrived by someone in that time. Nobody knew what water and blood from the side meant. Nobody knew that. John's redundant. He said, I saw it. I was there. I saw it. Yes, I saw it. It was me. I saw it. And he's redundant in his description about it. I was there. And this is what really happened. So, and Origen thought it was a miracle. You know, when we look at it and say, we can explain why that happened. It doesn't require a miracle to explain that.
Yeah, and I think if I understand correctly, what you're saying, just for the audience, is that you're saying that seeing it that as a medical thing that happened, a physical thing, the water and blood, even the fact that they didn't understand that back then illustrates the point that they didn't make the story up. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Just to make sure I understand you correctly, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the compelling point about looking at it. And then the other point is that we should not obfuscate the theological importance of the blood of Jesus and say things like he suffocated.
Yeah. And now I'll do my part to spread.
He didn't suffocate for the forgiveness of our sins. He shed his blood for the forgiveness of our sins. Correct.
Yeah, and I think that's a good theological point to end on. And as I was said, I'll do my part to spread this among pastors, that they can start preaching it correctly. I want to ask you, where can people, first of all, where can people get a hold of your book? And secondly, where can people follow you, whether it's on social media or website and so forth?
I have a website, Medical Doctor Examines Jesus. So I've posted things there, some blogs and the things that I'm interested in, my spiritual work, so to speak. And then the book is available on Amazon and wherever fine books are sold. Barnes and Nobles used to have some in stock. I don't know. But yeah, it's available on Amazon. And if I happen to come to South Africa, I'll bring a few copies.
That sounds great. I'll make sure that I'm one of the first people there, because I would love to have a copy. Dr. Joseph Bergeron, it was really a pleasure to have you on. I enjoyed it immensely. Before you go, is there if people want to dive a bit deeper into this topic, is there any literature, books, or even experts that you would point them to also go and have a look at?
Yes. Well, there's my book, of course, and everyone should have that. You can look at Gary Habermas's book, The Case for the Resurrection, I think, that he did with Michael Licona, is a easy read. It's a very cogent argument for the resurrection. Frederick Zugby's book, The Crucifixion of Jesus, A Forensic Inquiry. Dr. Zugby was a forensic pathology, did 10,000 autopsies in his career. So his book is very interesting and inspired me quite a bit. There's an article in the Lineker Quarterly, which is a Catholic medical journal by Thomas McGovern, where he reviews literature about the suffocation idea. And I think he kind of put that argument to rest. So the things that are important, I think, to theological students. I mean, you can get my medical journal article, but probably better get the book. It's easier reading, I think. But the article with myself and Dr. Habermas in the Irish Theological Quarterly, every theological student should have that, because that's the first time that the hallucination hypothesis is addressed and analyzed from a medical perspective and with theological input from Dr. Habermas. And Tom McGovern's article is an important one. But if you email me, you can go to my website and email me, and I'll answer. I'm try to be good about answering questions, and I can give you things that I would recommend also. But I think those are good starters to get a good background about the nuts and bolts of what happened.
Thank you very much. I think what I'll do is for my listeners and my viewers, I'll link. First, I'll put the link to Dr. Bergeron's website in the description, as well as the Amazon link to his book. And I'll see for my South African subscribers if I can find South African online store that also sells the book. And if I can find that, I'll link that as well. But Dr. Bergeron, thank you very much. I enjoyed this immensely. I'm looking forward to our next episode that we're going to do on the hallucination hypothesis. I think you gave us a really good preview, but I'm excited about that. Thank you for the honor and privilege to have you on.
My pleasure. Good to see you again.
It's good to see you too. For everybody at home, this is Hey Culture. Until next time, goodbye.